is the director of Villa Liebermann, and we'll both be talking to you about our respective exhibitions tonight. So I'm going to start and just tell you a bit about the collection that the Wiener Holocaust Library in London received, and our exhibition project, and then hand over to Lucy to tell you about the kind of genesis of the project at Villa Liebermann that is currently being shown at Villa Liebermann in Wannsee. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Yes, we called this talk "Finding Gerty," exhibiting Gerty Simon's work for the first time in 85 years, and it's really quite lovely and fantastic to think that finally, with this exhibition at the moment, Gerty's work is back in Berlin after all this time, so many decades after her flight from Germany. So the reason that the Wiener Holocaust Library in London even was able to stage this exhibition is because of a collection that we received into our archives in 2016. And this was the collection of Bernard Simon. And Bernard Simon died in 2015. He had been a Jewish refugee who came to Britain in late 1933, and his partner found in Bernard's possessions papers relating to Bernard's experiences as a refugee, his early experiences in Britain, and his experiences in Germany before that. And so he looked for a suitable location for these documents, and in the end donated the collection to the Wiener Holocaust Library. So I should say that for those of you who aren't aware of us, we're the world's oldest collection of material on the Nazi era and the Holocaust. We were founded in Amsterdam in 1933-34 and then relocated to London in 1939, and we have extensive collections to do with the Nazi era, the Holocaust, other genocides, and also very extensive collections about Jewish refugees who came to Britain to escape Nazism. And this is a photograph from the collection of Bernard Simon. So the collection contains, as I say, lots of documents about Bernard's experiences, including, for example, his experiences interned by the British authorities as an enemy, a so-called enemy alien during the war, where he was held in various camps, including in Australia, and he kept this diary of his experiences. So it's an interesting collection in its own right. The collection also contains papers relating to the lives of Bernard's parents, and he was an only child, and you can see him here in the middle with his parents, Wilhelm and Gerty, and we think this photograph is perhaps from 1930 or the early 1930s, perhaps in their apartment in Berlin, but we're not certain. Along with a documentary collection about Wilhelm and Gerty Simon, we also were lucky enough to receive this extensive collection of original prints of the photographs of Gerty Simon. And these photographs, as I say, had really been completely forgotten, had completely fallen into obscurity. And when our archivist first received the collection of Bernard Simon's documents, Bernard's partner Joseph said to him, "Oh, would you be interested? I've got all these photographs from the 1920s and 30s by Gerty Simon, and you know, she was once a famous photographer. They're quite interesting." And our archivist Howard said, "Yes, we'd be very much interested in this." And so we received this collection, and we started to look through these quite large prints and photographs that we had received. And as I say, the original prints produced by the photographer herself. And we were immediately struck on looking at the collection at the kind of power and intensity of many of the photographs. So you can see that here represented in this photograph of author Arthur Hollitzer. It's a really sort of striking, dramatic image. Some of the images have a kind of sort of sensual quality and that sort of quality to them. Some of them seem very much characteristic of their era. So here, these young women with kind of very 1920s hairstyles. Some of them have a kind of slightly mysterious quality, like this mother or assumed portrait of a mother and child. Another thing that struck us on looking at the photographs is that some of the subjects of the photographs are immediately recognizable. So most obviously, the portrait of Albert Einstein that you can see there, but also things like a portrait of Peggy Ashcroft, who in Britain was an extremely famous and prominent actress, now dead, but is a leading actress of her day. And we could see that Gerty Simon, a refugee from Germany, had photographed her. Another very interesting portrait that we were struck by is that of Käthe Kollwitz, really amazing photograph there. And there is also one of Max Liebermann that I think Lucy will touch on later. So we set about kind of doing some work on this collection, cataloguing it. The photographs had not been stored in ideal conditions. Many of them are warped. Some of them had mold damage, and you can sort of see that represented a bit on these two images, damage at the edges, damage at the bottom, the fact they're quite curved. And our photo archivist set about cleaning them, removing mold, working to preserve them and keep them properly. We worked to catalogue the collection and also to digitize it as well. So that was kind of the initial stages of what we did with the collection. Some of the photographs were identified in pencil, usually on the back. Some of the photographs were not identified but were of easily recognizable people. But many of the photographs were unidentified and not easily recognizable. So another thing that we did relatively early on was launch a kind of crowdsourcing campaign, along with speaking to some kind of experts in various things, to try and identify who the unknown subjects were in Gerty Simon's pictures. Some of them may have been, friends and might be difficult to identify, but we felt that some of them might be kind of prominent figures, and regardless, we'd like to know who they were. And we'll talk, Lucy and I will talk a little bit more about that kind of project later on. The documents that we had in the collection relating to Gerty Simon's life and career allowed us to piece together key things about her life. So, we were able to identify her dates of birth. So her dates 1887 to 1966. And we were able to find out details of her career, exhibitions that she held, important international exhibitions she was involved in, contacts that she had. There's extensive press clippings that she maintained, records of that show that her work was known about, well received, publicised extensively, and so on. And we were able to really piece together a fragmentary picture, but nevertheless a picture that quite convincingly established that, as the donor of the collection had said to us initially, she was indeed a prominent and well-known photographer of the day, but one that had fallen into obscurity. So we decided at the library to stage an exhibition of Gerty's work, also reconstructing the elements of her life and career that we were able to from the documentary collection. And we held that exhibition in 2019, Berlin, London, the Lost Photographs of Gerty Simon. And we used this really powerful image of the sculptor René Centennis as our kind of publicity image. It's just an image that we all loved in its kind of power and drama, really. So we launched the exhibition in May 2019. So it's just a few kind of shots of it. We in part of the exhibition space, we have kind of panels where we put information about Gerty Simon's life and career and some reprints of her photographs. We also had professionally done reprints of many of the photographs, and as you can see there, we kind of strung them up around the room, and were able to show quite an extensive selection of images in that way. We have, at the library, we have a number of exhibition cases, exhibition vitrines. So in those, we showed key documents from her collection, from her life and career, including on the left hand there, you can see a guest book that she kept in Berlin, which has been useful for some aspects of the research. On the right, you can see various documents, including her records of newspaper reviews and commentary on her exhibitions, letters that were in the collection as well. Part of the exhibition space was given over to a hanging of some of the original prints. So we had these conserved and professionally framed. None of the photographs came to us framed. They were all just loose on kind of thick card. And so we had these framed, and we had a section looking at the spirit of Berlin, as is a kind of not very good translation of one of the exhibitions that Gerty Simon held in Berlin. And then that's just another image of the Berlin section. And then we also hung some images from her time in London, including this striking self-portrait, but you can see a few others of them there. And so the exhibition focused on her career in Berlin and her re-establishment of her career in London, and we could tell from various bits of documentary evidence, such as this rather fun invitation to a grotesque, eccentric ball, Mardi Gras ball that Gerty seems to have drawn, which includes adverts for boxing, apparently, and dancing girls and lots of red wine and so on. And this was a party that Gerty, seen there on the bottom left of that photograph, held with her husband, Wilhelm, who's at the top of the photograph. And this is just a family photograph in the middle of one of their gatherings in Berlin. So yes, we talked about the exhibitions that Gerty was involved in, some that she held herself, big international exhibition that she had some work featured in, the contemporary photography exhibition, a very important exhibition. And what we find in Gerty's work, Gerty Simon's work, is that both in Berlin and London and Paris, where she took some images as well, she focused upon gathering portraits of kind of leading figures in different fields. So could be literature, as in the case of Leon Feuchtwanger and Walter Mehring. Actresses were a subject for her. Sometimes I think this was commercial work for them to get publicity images. Other times was more sort of portraiture. So this is Ali Gita and Sybil Reres. She photographed a lot of artists, including Elfriede Thum-Lachner, also known as Erich Thum, and Renee Sintenis, who I have mentioned. She also, these two men in these rather dramatic poses, perhaps reminiscent of kind of paintings really, are also artists, and this is Nikolai Vassiliev and Johannes Auerbach, probably captured in Paris in perhaps both instances. And these are two portraits, certainly from Paris, of André Tardieu, so French politicians, and Charles Vespier, another French artist. So these are some of some of Gerty Simon's work from Berlin. So she was prominent, she was reviewed in the newspapers, she had various exhibitions, she photographed the great and the good and the leading figures in Berlin culture, and then it kind of all came to an end. And so another thing that the exhibition focused on was very much the rupture in Gerty Simon's life, that this was a person who was kind of upper middle class, very assimilated, married to a lawyer and a judge, whose father was similarly a lawyer and a judge, who had this established career, who had this social position. And she decided, as she said later, that as a Jewish woman who'd photographed leading anti-fascist personalities, she felt she wouldn't be safe in Nazi Germany. Also, her son's school, and there's a photograph of her son's school on their way to Britain at the bottom there. Her son's school actually relocated to Britain also in late 1933. So I think she was also accompanying her son's school in their flight from Germany. So she left behind, you know, her house, her possessions, her career, her status, many friends, her husband as well. Her husband, and there's a document there on the right relating to him, didn't end up leaving Germany till after Kristallnacht. and he managed to get sponsorship to come to Britain in 1939, and that's a letter relating to that. So it really was a massive rupture, which is what makes the speed with which she re-established her career so striking. So within a year, Gerty Simon was holding this exhibition at the Store and Gallery in Chelsea. She'd already photographed a lot of leading London personalities by that point. So these included some of the figures in exile from Germany with her, such as Alfred Flechtheim, who curated Gerty Simon's second exhibition in London, had been a leading gallerist in Berlin. Lotte Lenya, Gerty Simon photographed in Berlin, and point when Lotte Lenya was briefly in London as well. And similarly to her photographs in Berlin, there were politicians. So here, Anira Bevan and Jenny Lee, both prominent Labour Party politicians, and these photographs are from about the year of their marriage. Also, Gerty Simon photographed actresses. This is a rather dramatic shot of the actress Oriel Ross. Also, once again, artists, so leading British artist Paul Nash, another British artist Frank Dobson as well, seen here in these very striking images. So the exhibition covered this story of Gerty's kind of establishment of her career, of the rupture in her life, and then the re-establishment in London. But as I've already mentioned, you know, really not long after this re-establishment in the mid-1930s in London, Gerty Simon stopped taking photographs. And then I think with the kind of disruption of her move, with the war that then came, really her reputation just kind of disappeared completely. And so it's been, you know, so fantastic, I think, that through this donation of a number of hundreds of her original prints, we've been able to do this work and bring her back to attention. So these are just a couple of sort of final images from me at the moment of Gerty Simon and Wilhelm later on in life. So they moved to sort of suburban South London. Eventually, after a lot of legal action, a lot of legal complications, Wilhelm Simon received compensation from the German authorities, I think by the sort of late 50s, and for loss of his possessions, you know, professional position, career, and various different things. And the couple built a small sort of modernist style house in South London that you can see there. So that's kind of the end of my remarks. So I'd like to hand over, I'll stop sharing, and I'll hand over now to Lucy to tell you a bit about the show, about their project and the show that they've currently got at Villa Liebermann.
Yes, thanks very much, Barbara, for this. It's always so fascinating to hear it all again. Obviously a very fascinating biography, and yeah, thank you for the invitation to take part in this event today. I'm just going to try and get my PowerPoint on, and I hope that is working. Everybody can see that okay, I hope. Yeah, so I'm kind of tuning in today from this beautiful place. It doesn't look like this right now, but it did actually look pretty much like this earlier today. The Liebermann-Villa on the banks of Lake Wannsee on the outskirts of Berlin is a museum dedicated to the life and work of the German painter Max Liebermann, located in his former summer home. Liebermann was, as many of you will know, I appreciate he's in Germany extremely well known, in the English speaking world perhaps less well known, but he really was, in the years around 1900, one of the most successful, best known painters certainly in Berlin, certainly in Germany. He had co-founded the Berlin Secession just before the turn of the century. He had established himself as one of the Berlin's most famous and successful portrait painters. From 1920, he was the president of the Academy of Arts in Berlin. And so he really had this fantastically successful career. And in 1910, like many kind of men of his generation, he built himself this house in Wannsee to spend summer with his family. His main house was on Pariser Platz, right next to the Brandenburg Gate. destroyed during the Second World War. Now there's a reconstruction of his former home there. And he spent basically from 1910, certainly from 1914, when he was no longer able to travel because of the war, he spent basically every summer here with his family, who we see in this photograph, his wife Martha, his daughter Kata, and his grandchild Maria, Kata's husband Kurt. So I just wanted to give you a very brief overview, because obviously part of the reason why we were interested in Gerty Simon as a subject was this point of contact with Max Liebermann, but I'll come to that in a moment. And I just wanted to show a couple of pictures because, again, I suppose I've kind of forgotten how well known Liebermann is in Britain, and I think it's just nice to give you a little overview of the kind of work he was producing. He was very active in Holland in the 19th century. Around the turn of the century, we see him moving ever closer to a kind of impressionist style of painting. These paintings date from around the turn of the century on the Dutch coast. This is a scene in the Dutch town of Noordwijk, and we can see this kind of very impressionist way of working. And then from 1910, in particular from 1914 onwards, the garden at Wannsee becomes one of his most important motifs. And over the next 25 years, he's basically here every summer painting and making pastels of the garden in Wannsee. And there's over 200 oil paintings of the garden alone from every possible angle, and a small selection we have here on display in our permanent exhibition. And we always have special exhibitions to go with it. So very brief history of the house. Wanted to show a couple of pictures. Liebermann obviously also came from a Jewish family. He died well into his 80s in 1935. His family were then forced out of Berlin. His daughter was able to emigrate to the United States because her husband was Catholic. His widow, Martha, made the decision to stay in Berlin and basically lost her possessions, kind of one after the other. The family art collection, the palace in Brandenburg Gate, the villa at Wannsee was subject to a forced sale, and she ended up committing suicide in Berlin in 1943 when threatened with deportation. So a very tragic end to the Lieberman Villa, to the Liebermann family in Berlin. And the Liebermann Society, which is still today the kind of organization behind our museum, was able to campaign for many years to take the house back again and to renovate it as a museum. By that time, the garden had been destroyed. There was nothing left in the house, but between the period of 2002 to 2006, it was fully reconstructed, and now it basically exists as in Liebermann's time. We've recently had some professional photographs taken, so I'm just taking the opportunity to show some of those. And you see here we have, in the former studio of the artist, some of his Wannsee pictures. And as I say, these special exhibitions. So how did we come to choose Gerty Simon for one of our special exhibitions? Well, we knew of the collection because of an exhibition we had done together with the Wiener Library in 2018 at the exhibition London 1938, which considered an anti-Nazi art exhibition which had taken place in London in 1938. And for that catalogue, Barbara wrote a fascinating catalogue essay about emigres to Britain in general, and one of the people she considered was Gerty Simon. And I remember in the course of those discussions, Barbara, I don't think you illustrated it in your catalogue, but we became aware that there was a Liebermann portrait in the Gerty Simon materials. So we knew that Gerty had done this portrait photograph of Max Liebermann. And so fast forward a few years, I'm back at the Liebermann-Villa after a couple of years working at the University of Bonn, and we're looking for subjects for our special exhibitions. And we remembered that there was this fantastic photograph, and that these pictures of Gerty's hadn't really been shown in Berlin, in fact, at all, since the kind of early 1930s. And so we decided to take this meeting between Gerty Simon and Max Liebermann as a kind of starting point for a special exhibition here at the Liebermann-Villa. And what was particularly interesting for us is we were 90% certain that the photograph had been taken here at the villa in Wannsee, because we have a fantastic thank you card written by Liebermann, which is still in the Gerty Simon archives today, written from Wannsee in September. So it suggests she was there during the summer. And so, this meeting actually took place here in this building where I'm sitting now, which I just think is really fantastic. So it was really an exciting opportunity for us to bring the pictures back. We wanted to tell, I mean, in the first place, we wanted to show these fantastic pictures, right? Barbara had shown us some of the digital files, and we saw how strong the pictures were, how appealing they were. We, of course, also wanted to tell her story, this idea of an artist who had this career in Berlin and then in London and then had been completely forgotten. Although, you know, you have to say that the photos were not entirely forgotten, especially here in Berlin. I mean, this photograph of Max Liebermann, for example, has been published relatively often in the years since 1945. The photograph of René Sintenis as well was a well-known picture of René Sintenis. It was just this name Gerty Simon that was basically unknown. What was also really important for us was that, okay, so we're showing the photos, we're showing Gerty's life. What we also wanted to do is try and address this issue of the archive. What did Gerty save during her lifetime? What did she keep? What did she preserve? What did she have translated? What did she take with her into exile? How did these materials allow us to reconstruct her career? And how far is she kind of forming her own memory of her own career? And then what happens to these materials after she stops working, after her death, right up to the death of her son then, and how the materials land in the archive in London. And I think that was also something we wanted to kind of show parallel, which is of course like quite a lot of different strands to show in a relatively small exhibition. So that was the kind of challenge, to think how this was possible. And then on top of all that, of course, we have Brexit, we have a corona pandemic. I think this exhibition was originally planned for summer last year, Barbara, or autumn last year. So many pushbacks, changes, but finally it was possible, and we opened it in August. So yeah, around August this year. So the resulting exhibition we called Gerty Simon, Berlin, London, a photographer in exile. And we have in the Liebermann-Villa, our exhibition rooms are on the first floor. The street side rooms, so to speak, are reserved for the Liebermann paintings, the permanent exhibition. And then on the lake side of the house, we basically have like 5.5 relatively small rooms where we have our special exhibition. So the challenge was, okay, how do we break it up? And we took a kind of similar structure to you, Barbara, in terms of this movement from Berlin to London. So this was our kind of opening wall, if you like, the opening moment of the meeting between Gerty and Liebermann. And so it's very important to us that we displayed them here. We worked in our exhibition almost exclusively with reproductions on the walls. In the vitrines, we had then selected original objects, but working with the reproductions allowed us a lot more flexibility. It allowed us to make the pictures ever so slightly larger and to make them more uniform, because as Barbara suggested, some of them were quite damaged, some of them were quite bent, and we knew that the way we wanted to present them with the archive material covering this large period of time in such small rooms, it can quickly become kind of too much from a visitor point of view, from a curatorial point of view. And so this allowed us to kind of, for example, take the colour completely out of all the prints so that they are purely black and white, and that gave the whole presentation a little bit more uniformity. And so we see here in this entrance room, we then had the original photographs of Liebermann and of Simon, and the original, two very important original documents. Lower left, you can see here this thank you card that Liebermann sent to Gerty Simon, and top right, you can see a text that Gerty wrote at some point, I think it's undated, Barbara, wie ich fotografiere, how I take photographs. And so this was kind of like something we took as another starting point for the show, what she's saying about herself and what do we actually see in the photographs. So we then structured it in the first room. We looked at the photographs from the time in Berlin, focusing mainly on the portrait photography. And again, with this kind of structure of photos on the wall and original documents in the vitrines. as you can see, then we're in the original Lieberman-Villa with this view onto the garden, which kind of is of course beautiful, but it adds kind of another point of interest into the rooms. So again, this idea of trying to make the photographs more uniform. And here you can see the opposite wall, how we combine then these photographic reproductions with the reproductions of the archive material. And we made the decision to work in these kind of two lines, the top line being the photographs and the bottom line being the archive material that kind of broadly related to what you could see in the photographs. We took this idea from one of the exhibitions in which Gerty was represented. I think, Barbara, you showed the pamphlet already, this exhibition Fotografie der Gegenwart, contemporary photography, where Gerty was shown, and we managed to find one of the interior photographs from this exhibition in 1929, and we thought it was fantastic, these like black lines, everything hanging in a line. And after very much kind of backwards and forwards, you realized, okay, the room we see here is a lot bigger than our rooms. We have to slightly reduce that, but we wanted to take elements of that into our own presentation. So that's where we kind of came up with these two line idea. So we started with Berlin. A small room next to the Berlin room was used to specifically look at the press work Gerty did when she was in Berlin. Obviously, Berlin, late 20s, this kind of media is exploding. There's huge demand for press photographs, and Gerty, like many other photographers of her kind of generation, wants a piece of that action, and so she contributes to lots of these publications in the Ullstein Verlag and many others. And so we wanted to show there a small selection of what was still in the archive. And there's another view of that room. And then, so you can kind of see here upper left how the rooms kind of flow into each other. They're all there on the lake side of the villa. Another small connecting room then from the Berlin room we used for the topic of exile. And this room is much narrower than the other rooms. And so we thought it would provide a nice opportunity to kind of show a different kind of photograph, namely the more personal photographs out of the archives, the photographs of Bernd as a child, the photographs showing this exile of the school to Kent, the photograph you've shown there, Barbara, of the family together, and a few of the materials which suggest how Gerty started to prepare for her exile. So the fact that she engaged a press agency to collect her cuttings. Our visitors have found that very interesting. We see here one of the recommendation letters she received, which she'd obviously had sought. You know, she'd obviously written to these. This was from the American photographer Francis Bougier, and she'd obviously asked for these letters, and he had provided. On the previous wall, perhaps we don't see it, but also in this room is an example of some of the translated German press reviews of her German exhibitions. She'd obviously, in preparation for Exile, had some of these reviews translated and mounted onto card, and so we're showing some of these documents as well in this room, Exile. And this is a room that I think a lot of our visitors have found particularly interesting, this idea of, like, as far as possible in an extremely difficult situation, strategically planning your exile so that you can keep working once you get, in this case, to Britain. And the final room, the final main room, is again a larger room, and that we dedicated to London. So we had these like two poles, Berlin and London, with Exile literally there in between. And in this room, again, we show many of the photographs from the London period, this very short but obviously successful period. And then in the kind of archival material, we show a selection of the press responses. And again, this is something that has come across very well with the Berlin visitors. I think specifically, you know, the way the kind of 1930s journalists in Britain are writing about Germany and German fashions, and, you know, I think it's proven quite a nice way into a lot of the material. Yeah, and a couple of the kind of press responses that have come across really well here, especially this tracksuit that Gerty wears in a lot of these photographs. And then I think she's quoted somewhere as saying, yeah, this is what everyone's wearing in Germany now. And, you know, people in Berlin are kind of saying, well, I've never seen that before, but it's nice. It gives a kind of personal edge to things. And also, you know, you have to, you know, a couple of the press responses from Britain are also quite openly anti-Semitic in their response to Gerty Simon. Not many, I think there's really one that is clear in, but I think that's also kind of an interesting element to sow a few seeds of why it then perhaps became difficult for Gerty after 1936. Although, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Barbara, we don't really have a definitive answer of why she stopped taking photographs. It's just to kind of sit, as far as I kind of interpret it, this kind of combination of factors. You know, she's faced with trying to get her husband over, then war, of course, then her husband and son are interned, then there's this kind of strong anti-German feeling. We already see the seeds of that kind of anti-German, anti-Semitism before, you know, 1935, and perhaps that's, you know, we don't know for sure.
No, there is a letter which might give a small indication from what seems to be one of her relatives to Bernard when he was in internment in Australia. Bernard appeared to have written to this relative and said, can you help me get, you know, mum and dad to the States? And this relative says essentially they're not in great health, they're too old, they can't establish a new career. So there maybe is a sense, you know, she wasn't that young even when her career first started, that neither her nor Wilhelm were perhaps in the best of health or state of mind really at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So we try and kind of hint at that story in this final room, and then in the last space of the exhibition here, one of the translations, this always comes across really well. This invitation card that Gerty's kind of jokingly made out to her then, 14-year-old son. You know, the Honourable Sir, Mr. You know, it's very sweet. And instead of sherry, he gets raspberry juice, chicken stock, and chocolate pudding. It's just like these, you know, like I said, this kind of personal aspect of some of these materials. And then along the corridor back to the main room, we addressed the issue of how the materials ended up at the Wiener Library. And again, with a couple of the photographs from after the war, there's one photograph from the internment camp, for example, and the photographs of the house in Surbiton, and the nationalisation, what's it called, the citizenship documents. And so this is kind of a kind of last section to the show. Yeah, we were really lucky that we got funding from the Berlin Senate for this exhibition, which really, you know, we are a small team here in the Liebermann-Villa. Our museum is funded completely from our members and our entrance tickets. So this funding really made a huge difference in allowing us to kind of expand our what's the word, like a kind of additional programming, how we can communicate the show, how we were able to try and attract new groups to the Liebermann-Villa. And with this money, we've really achieved some really interesting things for our house. We were able to employ an additional member of staff for the kind of 4 months of the exhibition, a kind of work student who managed to produce a film in collaboration with the TV channel Hauptstadt TV, and this is actually online. You can Google it and find it, about Gerty, our exhibition. And for example, you see here our work student Wanda with our curatorial trainee Victoria. They go to the Clausewitz where Gerty lived in Berlin and see what's there today. The apartment block is still there. They visit the room where she had her exhibition, for example, in the Kunstsalon Martha Gürtel. And so that's worth having a look. You can, like I say, you can Google that and find it. We were able to produce this little booklet with German translations of some of the materials, partly because, again, there was already a lot going on in the exhibition, so we didn't want to start including translations. And also with Corona, we were quite mindful that we didn't want people staying too long in the exhibition. And so with this booklet, we were kind of encouraging them somewhere at the Liebermann-Villa to take it outside and perhaps read a little bit in more detail outside. And we were able to have a go at trying to make our own contribution to the Finding Gerty campaign, which I think you're going to talk a little bit later more about, Barbara, but this idea of trying to identify some of these unknown sitters and direct people to this Flickr page. And we were able to produce a series of posters, you know, do you know this woman? Do you know this man? With some of these unknown subjects, and have them posted around Berlin. And thank you again, Barbara. Barbara's spies in Berlin managed to send her a photograph of these posters in situ, which I'd not seen yet, because I think they only went up a couple of days ago. So yeah, we're really pleased with them. It's really something totally different for us, and to get people interested in the exhibition and this idea of, you know, this huge store of unknown subjects, and hopefully then we'll get some more information about Gerty and her life, because that's basically what we're aiming for with these shows. We were able to organise a series of terrace talks, you know, Corona conform, outside with social distance, and we took 3 topics for these talks on 3 different evenings. We had one considering women photographers in 1920s Berlin, one looking at women photographers in exile, and then a third event looking at the idea of the neglected female artist, then and now. And it ended up being a lot more about kind of now, which was actually a really nice turn for the whole series of events. But then that was also what was kind of really, perhaps not surprising, but great as far as we're concerned, is that the exhibition has really kind of awoken this idea of a kind of feminist reading of the whole exhibition, of like how fantastic that we've got an unknown woman photographer here that's being re-explored, and what were women doing at this time. And, you know, I almost have the feeling people have been like, so fantastic, we're not just talking about Lieberman anymore, we're talking about the women that were working around him and at the same time, and how things were for them. And that's something that I think has kind of made us all think, yeah, this is something we should also explore a bit more in our next exhibitions that also have nothing to do with Gerty Simon. We were able to stage a series of photo workshops for kids in the garden, which were really fantastic. They came on 3 different dates and talked a little bit about black and white photography and how to structure, you know, composition and all this kind of thing. And that's been a lot of fun. And that was also something that our work student could help out with. And it's come across really well. I mean, the press has been great for the show. We've had a great reaction on social media. We have the feeling just from, you know, it's difficult for us to, obviously, like a lot of museums, we can't track exactly who is coming, but we have the feeling there's a kind of new audience here, perhaps more young people. The visitor numbers have been really great, considering it's Corona. I mean, still less than we would normally have in August, but we're really, really pleased, above what we were hoping for. And we've even managed to find out some more about Gerty and her biography and her life. And this is just one example. A family, German family living, I think, near Berlin, had found out about our exhibition, had seen the kind of marketing. And it turns out that they used to live next door to the Simon family in Surbiton. And it seems like a kind of little German colony around where she lived. There was a few other German families living there, and they shared some of their memories of Gerty with our curatorial assistant. And there's going to be a blog posted next week on the Lieberman-Villa blog with some of the results of what they said. And basically, the general impression seems to be she was a tough woman. She wasn't to be messed with. She knew what she wanted. By this time in her life, they don't remember her taking photographs, but they remember her painting a lot. And she always had her garage filled with oil paintings. So it was really, yeah. And another interesting thing is they were gifted a cookbook by Gerty that she says she wrote herself. We're still researching whether that's true, Barbara. Maybe you can help me. But it's been a fantastic way of like just finding more about Gerty Simon and her life. Yeah, so that's basically everything I wanted to talk about within this kind of presentation. But obviously, Barbara, I'll kind of hand back to you, and I'm happy to kind of answer questions from you, Barbara, from the participants. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Yeah, if you could just maybe stop sharing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. It's just really fascinating to get such an insight into the exhibition and how you've kind of developed things in a sort of similar but somewhat different direction to us, and presented the work very differently. It's really interesting to see it. So thank you so much. Yeah, so I think there's kind of a couple of points. I think you've touched on the reaction to the exhibition already, so that's been fantastic to see. And yeah, I mean the same kind of applied to our exhibition as well, that the press coverage, we got a lot of press coverage. It seemed quite easy to interest people in it. that we had a program of events exploring female photography, exploring Jewish photography in Britain as well, actually, and got kind of audiences thinking about different aspects of this story. We had one particularly interesting event in which a kind of photographic historian, art historian, really got to grips with the Renaissance tennis photograph very specifically, about kind of the significance and meaning of that and the story of Renaissance tennis's life, which is fascinating in itself. But yeah, I think it might be worth just saying a bit more about the Finding Gerty project. So as I've said, you know, some of these portraits were unidentified, and it was so great last night I got this image through on my phone of the posters in Berlin, and I'm sort of really pleased that you've taken forward that really intriguing idea. And I think I'm right in saying, so there's an identification that's come forward. I think I might actually have a picture of it, as a result of people that you've spoken to during your exhibition, I think. So I'll just share my screen again and hang on a moment, show this image. So we had thought the tentative identification, but we had tentatively identified, just based on other similar portraits, this photograph is possibly a portrait of the dancer Tatiana Babakov. And we'd featured in our exhibition, we'd had a kind of special section about Tatiana Babakov, and that is a definitely identified portrait of her. And there's the original print, and it's quite a curved one, as may be clear there. And Tatiana Babakov was of Russian, Jewish and Chinese origin, but living in Germany, and was a dancer, and very sort of committed to her art, from what we can tell from various bits of documentary evidence. And she is one of the only subjects, I think she is the only one of Gerty Simon's subjects, as far as we're aware, that was actually murdered in the Holocaust. Many of Gerty Simon's subjects in Berlin were forced into exile, or experienced, in Renaissance tennis's case, the end of her career, her works being removed from galleries. Some of the authors concerned found their books caught up in book burning. So many of her subjects were affected by the Nazi regime. But in Tatiana Babakov's case, she left Germany for Paris, but sadly that wasn't far enough. She then left Paris for the south of France, was in hiding, but eventually her hiding place was uncovered. She was arrested by the Gestapo and deported to Auschwitz, where she was murdered on arrival. And what we found when looking in a huge collection of digital documents that we have at the library, the International Tracing Service Archive, the originals of which are in Bad Arolsen in Germany, what we found in looking in this archive was that we actually found documentary evidence of the arrest and deportation and murder of Tatiana Babakov. So we kind of, it's a lovely photograph, but we devoted this sort of small part of the exhibition there to her. But we had thought that possibly this photograph was also Tatiana Babakov. But Lucy, I think somebody came in and looked at the exhibition and looked at this image and identified it, in fact, as another dancer, Mila Kirul. So, you know, this was a photograph that we weren't certain of the identity of, and we've now been able to put a name to this image. And some of the photographs that are unnamed, we have managed to, through crowdsourcing, through also just kind of people with some expertise on cultural scene in the 20s and 30s, identify them. So we have a number of really striking photographs in the collection of Alexander Ayalas, and they weren't named. There was no identification of them at all. They were such powerful images, but fairly early on, we received information that somebody recognized him, and we were able to identify him. He was a dancer at the time. Much later, he was a gallerist. He was an associate of Andy Warhol. He's quite well known in Greece, and I think there's been an exhibition to do with him there. So that was a kind of success, as with Mila Kirul, in our sort of Finding Gerty project. But as far as I'm aware, unless Lucy knows differently from the last few weeks, there are many images that remain unidentified, such as this sort of screaming man. Maybe he's an actor. It's a rather dramatic pose. These two, and I think on the right-hand side, you featured this lovely photograph in your poster campaign, but I think she remains unknown. So we don't know who these two are. So yeah, it's been a sort of theme, I suppose, of both exhibitions, that we're still looking for information and searching for unknown subjects. So yeah, I don't know if you want to say more about that, Lucy.
Well, just to briefly add to it, yeah, I mean, what's been fantastic is that we've attracted a lot of Berlin-based photographic historians to the exhibition, who, of course, you know, bring so much additional knowledge to it, and they're able to say, oh, no, that's not that, that's that, and also kind of put Gerty's work a bit more in context. I mean, they talked a bit about the kind of studio she would have had in Berlin in the 20s, and it was actually kind of much more common in those days for basically like just middle-class people, upper middle-class people, to have their photograph taken in this way, portrait photographs. And so in a way, it's almost like expected that a lot of these people today are forgotten, because it was something perhaps more normal to have done of yourself. We've learned a lot about the kind of cluster of female photographers working around Clausewitzstrasse, where she had her apartment and her studio in her apartment, kind of putting that in context. And also the way that like a lot of photographers of this time obviously wanted, especially if they fairly recently started their career, they wanted to build up a portfolio, and so they would go after a lot of these famous people like Max Liebermann. And Max Liebermann was perhaps like one of the favorites, that people would write to him and just ask for a photograph for their own portfolio. And so it might have been that that's the reason that Gerty came out to Wannsee. And I think it kind of confirms what we already knew about Liebermann, this kind of generosity in a way, that he was in many respects kind of often a bit grumpy perhaps, and the grand old man of the German art scene, but he was prepared to help out younger artists and to write a little card, you know, and something that we see elsewhere, and that we kind of see confirmed with his interaction with Gerty Simon. Although, as you say, she wasn't actually that young at that point, right? But
no, she was probably yes, what was she, sort of 40-ish?
Yeah, I think we said 46 by the time she went in exile, right? Would that be about right?
Yes, I think that's about right, yes. Yes, and she, as far as we're aware, she didn't really start her career, but we don't know. There's not anything written about it. We don't know, but as far as we're aware, she didn't really start her career till the mid-20s. So yeah, she wasn't very young, and it's interesting, I think, to speculate with her, because I would assume from her background and her marriage that she didn't really need the career for money, whereas some of the female photographers did. She may have needed her career for money, you know, to make money from it when she first came to London, and that may have been an impetus in just quite how energetically she set about re-establishing herself. She may have really needed the money at that stage in exile, and having had to leave so much behind, and her husband having lost his positions because you know, he was of Jewish origin as well. But I think probably, I would have thought in Berlin it was more something that she kind of wanted to do. But it's interesting to hear what you're saying about, in a sense, it does seem like she quite strategically set about building a career and a position, and making sure that she was known by the right people and making the right contacts, and she staged these exhibitions. I think it was commercial work sometimes, but also that my sense is that she regarded it as an artistic project as well.
Yeah, and that is a question that's come quite a lot actually from our visitors and at the various events, this idea of, like, you know, did she really need the money for it? And I think we've kind of come to the same conclusion, probably not in Berlin, and probably yes in the early stages of the emigration. And that again explains that kind of very strategic preparation, perhaps. But I mean,
yes, definitely, that she could see that. Yeah, but I mean, it may have also been a kind of almost psychological thing, that it was such a rupture, as I've mentioned, that at least if she was thinking, right, but I will carry on working. And I assume from what we can make out, given that she appears to be interviewed by journalists in the press, though it's a bit hard to say, maybe she gave them a quote, I assume her English was quite good. I don't know if the people that you met with recently were able to confirm anything about whether her English was good.
Well,
Or
the only thing, I mean, they definitely said that both her and Wilhelm in the, I think it must have been the 60s or 70s when they knew them, both had very strong accents and were very keen to speak German. As soon as they found they were Germans, it was oh, thank God, let's speak German. That's kind of the impression they had.
Yes.
But yeah, I mean, these texts that she translated of her own press responses, they're not badly translated. I mean, you can see that perhaps a foreigner has written them, but it's like which would fit with the kind of upbringing and education she probably had. Yeah, I mean, I think she probably did have a good command of English, just because of the way her career went when she arrived in Britain. You know, she was able to immediately connect with these people and talk to these journalists, and that she wasn't afraid to do so. But I don't know if you have specific information about that, but we're kind of...
Not really, other than what you can infer from what you've just said. I mean, the only thing that Joseph Brand, Bernard's partner who donated the collection, he didn't meet either of Gerty and Wilhelm because they were dead, you know, before Bernard and him were together. But he did say that, you know, I think from what Bernard said, Wilhelm didn't really have English, I think, much at all. So it might have been, along with perhaps not wanting to give up on his professional career altogether, and perhaps a hope that the Nazi era would pass quickly. Well, these are sort of all reasons why maybe Wilhelm didn't leave with the rest of his family. But my assumption is that Gerty, I suppose, even if it was a very difficult decision, and she probably partly went, you know, because her son was going, obviously, but nevertheless, that she felt a little bit more confident about operating in Britain than perhaps Wilhelm did, and a little bit more able to do so. So yes, but whilst we've got some great letters and evidence of exhibitions and press cuttings, you know, partly which have been preserved because she preserved them. It's, you know, we don't have a diary, we don't have that many letters, we don't have any evidence of what education Gerty Simon received. So there's huge kind of gaps. And I think there's a question actually in the chat, which I don't have an answer to, was Gerty considered to be an enemy alien and prevented from working? There's no documents in the collection that definitively say that, you know, she was assessed as an enemy alien. She was likely to have been, though, and her husband and son were both arrested and interned, even though Bernard had been in Britain since he was about 12 and you know, he'd had his childhood partly there and been educated in Britain and so on. And the documentation makes clear that the authorities were aware he was a Jewish refugee. So, but I don't know. There's not, you know, there's not any documentation. You sometimes in our collections, you know, you find letters where you can see that someone's been assessed as an enemy alien, but I don't know. But it's certainly, as Lucy was explaining earlier, it wouldn't have kind of helped with her career probably at that point, despite being a Jewish refugee, that you know, the kind of German origin and all of the problems there. So yes, so but it's a very fragmentary documentary collection, but in some ways I quite like that, because this kind of leaves these things still to be discovered, and it's quite sort of tantalizing, really.
And I'm sure you would discover a lot if you went, or if somebody went to Bremen and looked in the Stadtarchive there, and, you know, you'd find out about her education and her parents probably, and, you know, that would certainly fill those gaps.
Yes, I mean, there is a little bit on her father, like there's an obituary, and he was clearly, I mean, they were a Jewish family, but he was clearly very kind of assimilated and in, you know, kind of the you know, fraternities in German universities, and quite a high status kind of a person. So there's a little bit about him that certainly gives, you know, the impression that she would have had a relatively privileged upbringing socioeconomically in a very assimilated kind of, you know, German family. So yes, we're sort of slightly running out of time. I think maybe one thing you'd mentioned, Lucy, is just avenues for further research. And I suppose, as for myself, as I'm not a kind of historian of photography or anything like that, I suppose I am always interested in learning anything we can more about Gerty Simon specifically in her life and career. But also I think this idea of that really has come to the fore in your exhibition about this exiles planning for their time, you know, planning the move in a sense, and planning how to re-establish a career and what might be needed, I think is really fascinating. And so yes, you know, we've got a lot of documentary evidence at the Wiener Library about people trying to re-establish themselves post-exile, and that's quite an interesting kind of angle.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it's always, you know, researching a lot about this period of history, and I've obviously looked specifically at artists and their families and things, but you realize as well how much it's got to do with personality, and this kind of, you know, awareness or preparedness to do certain things, to prepare in that way, can have such a massive influence. I mean, when you look at her career, 34, 35, 36, it's like everything you could wish for as a British photographer, let alone you know, and then the way that just dies out. And, you know, it's kind of, yeah, in the course of some of these conversations about women artists and their neglect today, and a couple of members of the audience were kind of saying, oh, well, look, women just have to work hard, or like anyone, you know, if you work hard, success will come. And it's, I think the story of Gerty shows you that that's just a tiny part of the picture. It's a tiny, tiny part, and all the other factors that can kind of impact on whether someone can work, how their work is received, how it's remembered. Maybe it's a slightly obvious point, but I think it's always like worth repeating, I guess.
Yes, yeah, and even someone like her, you know, who had certain, I suppose, sort of privileges, though I do think, you know, the family were left pretty impoverished for a time because of the Nazi regime. It's still, you know, with her contacts and confidence and certain advantages, it's still all very difficult, very exhausting. And, you know, she was very successful in London in a way, but for such a short time, and then her reputation just sort of vanished for a while. And yeah, I think she did paint a lot from what we understand, but there's not really a sense that was a successful, you know, in terms of at least selling paintings. You know, I think there's evidence she displayed something in the summer exhibition at the Royal Academy, but it didn't really sort of go further than that. Yeah. I think someone suggested to me that one reason she might have switched from photography to painting is just that it's physically less demanding. As neither a painter nor a photographer, I couldn't really comment, but that her style of photography is quite kind of physically demanding, and that as she got into her 50s, 60s, it was a bit more difficult to sustain. But
I don't know, I suppose it depends how you paint and how big. I see someone's posted in the chat whether or not any of her paintings are known. I've certainly not seen any.
I have seen a black and white copy of the one that was in the Royal Academy. But she did not, you know, well, Bernard did not pass on many of her paintings. I don't know what happened to them. I should probably ask Joseph to see if he knows. Joseph thought he had one of her paintings, and we displayed it in the exhibition, but it has a signature that appears to be, in fact, it has a dedication, and in fact it seems to say to Mrs. Simon from somebody whose signature I can't read. It's a really nice sort of Weimar cafe scene. It's a really lively portrait, but we didn't manage to identify who it was by, but I don't actually think it's her signature. I think it's got her name on it, but it's someone like, you know, it's a gift. So no, the one I've seen, it's an impressionist sort of style. It's not wildly different from some of Max Liebermann's, actually.
Oh yeah, that's fascinating. I would love to see it.
Yeah, I'll send you a picture of it. But yeah, it's only black and white, unfortunately. So no, so all those paintings that these connections of yours talked about her producing, they just appear to have been disposed of, sadly. As were the negatives, sadly, as well. So I think we've slightly sort of overrun and run out of time, but I hope people sort of found that interesting to hear about the collection and Gerty Simon's life and career and the two exhibitions. And for those of you that are able to, you know, go along and see the exhibition in Wannsee.
Absolutely, and obviously when people can travel to Berlin again, come and see us anyway. We have a changing roster of exhibitions and always Max Liebermann.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you
very much.
Very much.
Thanks, Barbara. Thanks, everybody,
That's
for being
okay.
there.
Thank you. We'll end the event quite abruptly, just to warn you. 'cause it's